Welcome to the Franchise Secrets Podcast with your host, Eric Van Horn. And today's guest is Eric Stites, who is the CEO and Managing Director of the Franchise Business Review. And I've been a big fan of Franchise Business Review before I got to know Eric. And so I'm excited to have him on the podcast today. But before we get started, I've had a lot of people that are reaching out to me and saying, Eric, I can't reach you. How do I get in touch with you? I'm listening to your podcast. I want to buy a franchise. I don't know how to talk to you. Just go to talkwitheric.com. Talkwitheric, ERIK.com. And by the way, I think I might be spelling my name the right way. Eric Stites spells his the wrong way. But we won't get too much into that. Eric, welcome to the show.
Hey, thanks for having me. I appreciate it. That's the Eric and Eric show.
That's right. I like it. So the Franchise Business Review, I know that how your magazine does things differently than a lot of lists out there. And so I know a bit of the origin story and how it came to be, but I'd love you to kind of go back to the beginnings of how you came up with this idea.
Yeah, great. Well, we've been doing this 15 years, and back in 2004, 2005, I was previously with a franchise marketing company that specialized in lead generation, helping people find franchise companies, and was working specifically on a project with Dunkin' Donuts, and they were having challenges with people finding and getting in contact with their franchise owners and validating as part of that sales process. And we just kind of came up with the idea of, why don't we survey franchisees? Everybody, pretty much wants to know the same stuff, as the training.
Let's dive into the problem there, because we were talking about it earlier, and I think it's really important, and I like it because there wasn't a problem with validation. So franchisors, when we typically hear they have a problem with validation, that means franchisees don't like them. They're not doing very well, and they don't do phone calls, or they do, and they're just blasting the franchisor. That was not case, was it?
No, not at all. And the reality for most franchise companies, or all franchise companies, is that franchisees are working 60, 70, 80 hours a week plus, and returning phone calls from candidates who they don't know, who may be just kicking the tires and not that serious. Like, that's not high priority necessarily for them. So again, in the case of Dunkin' Brands, they had great franchisee validation if you talk to franchise owners, but it was just hard to get those people on the phone. And so by this idea of doing a survey with their owners, that just kind of facilitate that process and really kind of get that information from them, and be able to use it in mass. And so the idea kind of broke apart because they were like, oh, it has to be third party, and I kind of the light bulb kind of went off in my head. So I unfortunately went to my boss at the time and said I was leaving the company to go start my own thing. So, since 2005, been researching franchise companies, surveying franchisees and asking them about, their experience with the brand. I guess the interesting part, as I was telling you, is, this really started out as a tool to kind of facilitate that development process, and quickly evolved into much more of an operational tool to really help franchisors get better. It's taken a long time to get where we are today. We've worked with over 1,100 brands, and we survey hundreds of brands each year. But at the time, it was really about, how do we facilitate the validation process? And we came up with this idea for awards. But 2/3 of the companies that we surveyed didn't qualify for the awards. They just didn't have high enough for franchisee satisfaction. So,
like, what do you mean? Like, give me some example. Like, 2/3 is a lot. They didn't qualify. So, like, what does not qualifying mean?
Yeah, I mean, basically, we just looked at all the data. When we first announced that we were going to do our first annual awards, we had over 150 companies sign up in a matter of months, and when we looked at that data, there's all sorts of rankings out in the industry, Entrepreneur 500 and Franchise Times 200, and they go on and on. We wanted a really exclusive list of the best of the best, so we came up with a list of the top 50. And so when you're talking about 50 companies, who are those, best of the best, again, from the perspective of the franchisee, you know, who's, not only who's got the best satisfaction, but, part of our survey also asks them about their income. So, are they making money? Are they getting a return on investment? Which, as a former franchisee and an existing franchisee, making money is kind of one of the primary reasons people go into business. So,
Yeah, I hear that a lot. A lot of the people that I work with, they want to make money.
yeah. So, franchising, we'll probably talk a lot about it. It's no silver bullet. It takes a lot of work to be successful as a franchise owner, as any business owner.
Mhm.
I think one of the challenges that franchising has as a whole, as an industry, is that a lot of people come to franchising as prospective candidates, and they think it's easier somehow to own a franchise than start their own business or to be business owners. And the reality is, it's a proven concept, but it's not any easier. I mean, you still have to work very hard as a business owner to make that business work. And I think we all know business owners in our life and see the lifestyles that they have, and we get attracted to that, and we're like, wow, I want to own my own business and play golf 3 days a week too. That can happen over time, but generally, it takes a good 5-10 years to get to that point. It's not buy franchise and go.
No, it's so true. I mean, I was just talking to my friend Brian, co-host of the Franchise Story podcast, about that. And it's easy. I'm 42. I got started in my mid 20s, and it's easy to forget the grind and the hours and the work and the stress and the bad decisions that I made as I was growing, because you make bad decisions, and it impacts you, and it hurts at times, but you learn from them. And then fast forward, where I am today is just like, I never dreamed I would be in this place, being able to do what I do and have the kind of lifestyle. But I caution people often, like, just because it's not the brand that gave me this lifestyle all of a sudden. There was a lot that happened before that. And so I love, that's why, I love what you guys do. It's franchisee focused list. It's franchise validation. It's all about them and not about how fast they grew. All these lists have different uses for different things, but you can't confuse them. And if you want to look at a top, the top 10 franchise and whatever, if it's based on how quickly they've grown, that may not be what's important to you. But like, why do people love Franchise Business Review? Like, the prospective candidate, the person looking at franchises, what do you hear often? Like, I'm so glad that you asked this, or I found this in the magazine.
Right. Well, it's a great question. I mean, you think about the world today. I mean, nobody buys anything without some sort of, peer validation, whether it's Amazon reviews or Yelp or Glassdoor or whatever, but in 2005, that didn't exist. So it was kind of brand new to both franchisors and franchisees. I think the biggest thing that I always tell people is, I mean, you want to get with a brand that has good satisfaction with their franchise owners, but more importantly, you want to talk to as many franchisees as you can to really get inside their head and find out, what is the culture of this company really like? Satisfaction is great, but if you're not going to hang out with these people, and these aren't the kind of people that you would, have a beer with at the bar and kind of exchange best practices, it's probably not the best fit for you. And so, whether it's our ranking or the Entrepreneur 500 or any, top franchise ranking, you really want to understand, what is it, what type of person succeeds in that franchise, and be honest with yourself, because, if you don't have the skill set to be successful in that brand, you may have the money to buy in, but if you don't have the skill set, then that may not be a great fit for you. So that's what we tell people all the time, is that, we've got the top 200 now. We've surveyed so many brands, and we can break that down by industry and, who the most satisfied brands are. But again, if you're not passionate about that brand, if you're not passionate about the people that are part of that brand, then it's probably not a good fit.
That's great advice, and I've seen this. And I might get in trouble from different from a
No.
industry right now, but I'm going to say something. Like the senior care business. Like I've been in the senior care business, and a lot of people get into the senior care business because they're passionate about helping people, and that's their motivation to get into it. And if they started to validate and ask owners, like, what do you do every day? What's the day in the life of you as the owner? All of a sudden they're realizing like this person is more of a salesperson,
Right.
or they are an HR guru where it may as well be a staffing agency for senior care staff. And that's
Right.
really what senior care is. So that's what, we look at when I'm trying to help people find good brands. There's more than meets the eye with all of this stuff. And
Yeah.
like you mentioned, culture. And that's one thing, like, it's hard to measure that. It's hard to or understand that if you're just looking in a magazine or something. So
Right.
like, how do you, I know how I understand culture in these different brands, and I can see if someone would match up or not match up to the culture, but it's really
Right.
hard to do unless you're deeply entrenched in the brand. So what advice would you have for someone that's wanting to understand the brand's culture and they're wanting to, utilize franchise business review in that mix?
Yeah, I mean, certainly, satisfaction is a component of that. But you're right. I mean, different brands have very different cultures, and I always encourage people, if they can, um, not only go to a discovery day, but try and go to the annual conference of a brand. I know that's a big ask a lot of times because usually it's an annual thing. Um,
That's why they call it an annual conference.
yeah, yeah, exactly.
No, but yeah,
Um,
no, that's a great idea. Like you said, it's a really big ask, but comes about once a year, and a lot of franchisors will not want you to go there. But
right.
boy, if you can, that's a great.
Yeah, some franchisors are obviously very protective about that culture, but I think the smart ones will let candidates come and see. And I mean, I have the benefit of speaking at a lot of franchise conferences, and some you go and you know very successful brand, and it's very quiet and formal, and at 5 o'clock comes and everybody disperses, and the night's over. Others I've been to, Kona Ice is a great example. I mean, their conference is like a 3-day party, and their franchisees are whooping it up till midnight and talking about business and the hallways, and it's a whole different kind of feel. And again, not that one's right or wrong, but depending on the type of person you are, if you're an introvert or an extrovert.
Mhm.
You mentioned, sales and marketing skills, really understanding that skill set of the franchisee. And I know, many franchisors will say you can hire for whatever you're lacking. So if you're more of an operational type, you can hire the sales and marketing, or vice versa. Um, I'm always of the school of thought that whatever that core strength is, you really need to be personally good and strong in that area. I mean, you might hire additional staff to support you, but if sales and marketing is not your thing and operations is your thing, you're going to have a very tough time in a very sales and marketing driven organization.
For sure. And I get that. Like I'll have people that are working with other consultants, and they're like deep into this like sales marketing driven organization, and they'll tell me, Eric, I hate sales. Like I don't
Right,
want to do
right,
sales. And yet they're being convinced like you can do this because you just hire the salesperson. On the flip side, a salesperson, it's hard from an operational person to hire that salesperson, and manage that, especially to understand that if the company is a sales driven company. But I think it's easier for a salesperson to hire the operational person.
right.
And what do you think about that? Does the flip side is the same? Like,
Yeah. I mean, it does. It's challenging both ways. Certainly salespeople tend to be a little less organized and a little less detail oriented, and um, so they need that strong operational person to make their business successful. Um, it's that balance. I mean, the ideal situation I've seen in a lot of franchises is a husband and spouse that go a husband and wife that go into business together,
Mhm.
and they divvy up those, positions. And, that can be a good balance, obviously, depending on, some people may not be able to work with their, their spouse all day long. Um, so I'd caution you there too, but, and for sure, just while we're talking about spouses, and I'm hoping that as a consultant, you probably do this too, but, whenever somebody's looking at franchising, I tell them, make sure that your spouse is engaged in this process from day one. You want them talking to the franchise development folks and talking to the consultant if one's involved. And because have so many cases where somebody gets, so far down the path with a brand and an idea, and they're like, honey, look what I'm going to buy. And, and the whole thing just blows up. So certainly whether you're going to invest with your spouse or not, make sure your spouse or partner is involved in that process.
No, that's some really good advice. I was talking to somebody on the phone Monday, and their spouse, and I don't make the spouse be on the phone with me, because I let them know, I get a read on how the relationship is and how active the spouse wants to be involved. And this one particular guy said, make sure your spouse is on the call, on our next call. And he said, oh, she couldn't make it. I'm like, well, then let's postpone. Well, I don't know if she'll ever be able to make it. And then the conversation just went south from there. And I ended up, doing what I was going to do on that call, but I was very clear with him, I'm not doing this for me. Well, I am in some ways, because I don't want to waste my time, but I also have done this a million times, and I know what's going to happen. You're going to get excited about a brand, and then all of a sudden that, and maybe it is the right brand for you and your family, but your spouse is going to get involved with it after you've done 5-6 weeks of research and you're ready to do something. And then you try to bring her on, and now you try to educate her on it. So we all know the outcome of that. So you're not doing yourself any justice by, not having your wife involved with it. Same goes with people that don't have money and they have an investor,
Right.
It's the same thing. So
yeah. No, I mean, as a business owner, whether your spouse is involved in the day-to-day or not, I mean, it's going to heavily impact your personal life. So, having those conversations with your spouse and your family to understand, this is what I'm thinking about. Yeah. This is, my hopes and dreams. And, you want everybody supporting you, because, it is, as we said, it's a lot of hard work, especially in those early years. And if you don't have that family support, it's never going to fly.
So as people are going through the investigation process, they're hopefully having a copy of Franchise Business Review open on their desk. Are there certain brands that you guys just don't have in there because they're too young at this point? They're the emerging brands.
Yeah, I mean, we don't do a lot of emerging brands. Just and in the way we define it is, you have to have a franchise company has to have at least 10 open and operating franchise owners. Which is still an emerging brand, but it's not brand new. And so if they can show success, and we weight our survey results. So if somebody's only got 10 franchisees, they have to have a much higher score in order to make our ranking than, say, a company that's got 250 or 500 franchisees.
Give me an example of some of these, like an emerging brand that is just, they've maybe surprised you, or
yeah. Well, I mean, you mentioned senior care. So First Light Senior Care is a company that we've surveyed for years. And I can tell you another funny story about our former editorial director, who's now a franchisee with them. But I knew their CEO. Yeah. I've known their CEO for years. He was with another senior care company, left that senior care company to start First Light. And, I knew he had all the resources and his heart in the right place, and was putting together this incredible team. As soon as they got to 10 open and operating franchisees, they started, surveying with us, and immediately made our awards list. Fast forward, our editorial director from about 5 years ago ended up buying one of them buying a First Light with her husband in the Boston area. Unfortunately, the plan was that he would run the business and she would keep her day job, but they quickly found out that it was, really a two-person requirement. So she left us, and they've been very successful in the Boston area. And now First Light, it's close to, I think, 200 locations around the country. And similar story. I mean, Orange Theory Fitness, who I think everybody knows now, they started working with us very early on, surveying with us when they had, a couple dozen franchisees.
Wow.
But, there's a lot of companies that point of getting to 100, locations or even 50 locations. The vast majority of franchise companies out there, and the universe is, it's a moving number, but it's roughly about 3,000 brands. Half of those brands are under 50 locations. And a lot of them, never get much beyond, 25. And so a lot of people get into franchising, they get 10, 20, 30 franchisees and realize, whoa, this is a lot harder than I thought, so those, the stories of like the Orange Theory Fitness, the Planet Fitness, the Kona Ice, which went from a couple dozen to hundreds, in a few years. I mean, those are very few and far between. Subway is a great example too. I mean, Subway took, a couple of decades to get over 100 units. It didn't happen overnight.
Any
Certainly
common
faster.
thread in those that you mentioned, with few franchises open, a couple dozen like Orange Theory and
Right.
Nice. Any common thread that you've seen with emerging brands that seem to be have a better chance for success, better chance of being at that point in the future?
Well, the thing that I look at, I'm a kind of a geek when it comes to franchise disclosure documents. I love reading franchise disclosure documents.
I've never met anybody like that. So,
but when you look at an emerging brand, if you can see, the beauty of a franchise disclosure is that a franchise company has to have their own financials in there. And if you can see that the franchisor is investing income back, profits back into the business to grow and support the system, that's obviously a very good sign. I mean, if a franchise company shouldn't be showing a lot of profit in the early days, I've seen FTDs where, the owner, they make $500,000, $1 million, and the owner will do a distribution, basically to himself. And it's like, wait a minute, you're not investing in operations staff, you're not investing in additional marketing and training and support. And so that's something to really look at when you're looking at an emerging brand. People ask me all the time, would you invest in an emerging brand versus an established brand? And, obviously there's a different risk profile there. But, there's lots of brands out there that are emerging that I think are potentially going to be great opportunities. Maybe not, but, time will tell, certainly. But if you can see that they're, investing in training and support staff and, putting their money into operations and marketing and investing in additional people, that's obviously a good sign.
That's some good advice. And I love what you were saying, like, we don't know what's going to happen with these brands. Right. If you have some guru or a consultant like I am, but they're telling you like, this is the next whatever. And we don't know. You don't know. And the X factor really is, in many cases, the franchisee, but you can, there are things to look for, like what you just said. And I haven't really thought about that before. I've looked at that because I look at it from a different lens of what I'm seeing and hearing from franchisees if they're doing that. But this is how someone that doesn't have the inside information like you have and I have, they can look at that franchise disclosure document and clearly see the flow of the money. And a lot of times what they look like, this company's not making any money. Well, they're investing it back into the business, and that's a good thing.
Yeah. Yeah. And I mean, when you sit down and talk to the owners as well, too, I mean, or the franchisor, you certainly want to understand, what that ownership structure looks like. Is it a one-off, privately held company? Is it private equity backed? Are they affiliated with other brands? Is there some other success story there that, even though this is an emerging brand, maybe it's part of a bigger system that has a history of success, or, flip side, a history of failure. So, most people, I joke that once you get into franchising, whether you're a franchisor or a franchisee, most people never leave the industry, or a supplier like myself. So read, the items 1 and 2 of the disclosure too, just, who are these people behind this franchise brand? What's their experience? Is this their first company? Probably not. They've probably been at other franchise brands. At least some of their team has, and see what their background and history of success actually is.
Yeah, I like emerging brands when I can see like everything that you've just said, and they have experience in the industry, or someone on their team that's a key member of the team, and maybe they're an owner or like a key executive, but they're in the industry and they
Right.
know the industry very well, and they have franchise experience. Someone, the founder or or a new person that came on in the ownership actually has franchising experience. Because it's one thing to know franchising, it's another thing to know the industry. But when you marry the two, that gives me a lot more comfort. Is there anything that you would add to that?
Yeah, I mean, I think the franchise development team certainly speaks volumes. I think when you make that initial contact with a brand, whether it's emerging or not. I mean, I always tell people, I mean, this should feel like the hardest interview that you've ever been on. I mean, if you can think back in your career when, you really wanted a job, and you came in and you sat down in a conference room and there was 4 or 5 people that were hammering you, and, and they really vetted you before they offered you the job. And it was probably a series of interviews. That's what the franchise development process should feel like. I mean, they should be vetting you just as much as you're vetting them. And, I think we've all experienced overly aggressive salespeople. Not to be, a lot of people, talk about the used car salesman and what's it going to take to get you today? If you're feeling that sales pressure, kind of the most common thing is, oh, we've got somebody else interested in your territory. If you don't sign today, we're going to lose this opportunity. I mean, most of that is smoke and mirrors. Now, sometimes that can be real, but most of the time it's smoke and mirrors. And, you want a representative of the company to be professional and persistent with you. And, when they say they're going to call next week at 2:00, hopefully they do. And they may help you. Franchise candidates are typically very disorganized in the sales process, in the franchise development process. And so they should be helping you and getting you the resources that you need to make a decision. But if you feel like you're being pressured to make a decision rather than being educated and kind of vetted, that's a huge red flag for me. And that's where I think, again, a lot of emerging brands that, they're under kind of more pressure to sell franchises because they can't survive on royalties yet. That's where it can be hard, from the development standpoint to, truly vet a candidate to say, oh, you're not a right fit for our brand, we're going to move on.
It's so true. And I look at that as I'm talking to candidates, and the hardest thing for them, they don't know when they're being sold and when they're not. Even the fact that a lot of people think they're not looking at me as much as I'm looking at them. I'm looking at them way more than they're looking at me because they have money, they have this, they have that. And I don't. I put my life savings on the line. So this is a much bigger risk for me. And in the flip side, some franchises are just looking for someone that can write the check. But there's a lot of franchises out there that are absolutely watching, like, are you showing up? Are you doing what you say you're going to do? And they're really vetting these people out. They don't get invited to a discovery day, or they get told no before, after discovery day or at some point in the process. But the average candidate, they don't really look at it from that perspective, and they really should be.
Yeah. No, it's interesting because franchising obviously is very much a systems oriented business model, and you have to be able to follow follow steps and processes to be successful. And franchise companies, good franchise companies, will set up their development process with steps just like that. And the first red flag for them is, well, this candidate, they're disorganized, they're not making meetings, I'm following up with them and they're not following up with me. I mean, obviously those are the things. And to be fair, I think a lot of people dream of owning their own business and start exploring and contacting franchise companies too early. And so they're really not in a place yet where they're going to make a decision in the next 6 months or a year. It's probably going to be another year or two down the road. So, in fairness to franchise development folks, and franchise consultants and coaches like yourself, you shouldn't really engage until I want to own my own business. I don't know what business I want to own, but something in the next 6 months to a year is probably the right fit. I mean, some people are 2 or 3 years down the road, and they're just not ready.
They should just be listening to the Franchise Secrets and the Franchise Story podcast.
Yeah,
but really,
exactly.
That's one of the reasons that, I created this, because I get a lot of people. I know they're not ready. They don't know that yet, but
Right.
They start listening to this and they start, consuming content, and they pick up your magazine and they pick up the Entrepreneur magazine, they start researching. But you need to be closer to at the point where you're ready to make a decision before you really start investigating a franchise, because they don't, because there's a beginning and an end to that. It just doesn't go on indefinitely.
Right.
So yeah, that's interesting. I think a lot of people contact franchisors too often, and I've had people get frustrated at me because I know they're not ready, and I tell them they're not ready. And it's another common misconception. People think, well, to be fair, there's a lot of consultants that need the money to pay for their bills, to pay for their lifestyle. I'm not one of those. I have franchises. I have other sources of income. So it's like, if you end up buying this franchise, it's not changing my lifestyle one bit. But people have this, they're just afraid of being sold. And I think that's why we're talking, because we want to get accurate, truthful information out to the masses. So they can hold that up and compare that against what they're being told, and I love what are some of those things in Franchise Business Review that you may have been a little bit of concerned about putting in there, because you didn't want to make franchisors mad because you're going to prevent them from selling franchises. You're kind of going against the grain. Did you ever experience any of that?
Yeah. I mean, we do, we don't share really detailed information about specific brands without the brand's permission, but we do publish a lot of aggregate data. And particularly, one of the things that we do publish is around franchisee income. And so, that's something, nobody else in the industry has that. We ask that as part of our survey results or survey process. And and obviously franchise companies can get a little bit squirrely when it comes to, how much a franchisee is making, their average franchisee is making. And to be honest, a lot of franchisors don't actually know, which sounds outlandish, but, they know what the gross sales are, but they have no idea, how profitable their franchisees are. And in many cases, they're afraid to ask. We do. And so, what I tell people all the time, and we do an average benchmark. So, for those that want to know, the average is $93,000 a year. So, what that number represents, and it's kind of a joke because it's not all that useful, but that's an average of about 30,000 franchisees that we've surveyed in the last 18 months. And it's been, gradually increasing the last, 5-6 years. Now, somebody might look at $93,000 and be like, yeah, I want to make $93,000, sign me up. Others will be like, what? That's like way too low. And it's just an average number, and averages can be, clearly very misleading. So that includes multi-unit owners, that includes single unit owners, that includes people that have been in business for 6 months and people that have been in business for 10 years. So you really got to kind of drill down and understand, what's a realistic financial expectation for this business that I'm looking at? We talk about, not contacting franchisors. I always tell people, go out in your community and network, find franchise owners and find, business owners in general. And just talk, go to business networking groups, go walk into businesses and meet, introduce yourself to the owner. I mean, most of the time these people will be very receptive to you. Don't walk into a business and say, oh, how much money did you make last year? Because they'll, slam the door in your face. But if you get to know them and understand their business and what they've put into that business, that really will give you some perspective. And again, most small business owners, aren't rich. I mean, it's not just about the money. It's, obviously they have flexibility in their schedule and the pride of just owning a business. But some do, some business owners, franchise owners are very successful. And so depending on what your financial needs are, and, I get calls all the time from candidates that are like, Eric, I need to make 150 grand a year. I want to ideally work part-time. What's a good business for me? And I'm like, if you find that, let me know, because I want that too. There's businesses that can produce that amount of capital, certainly. But, on a part-time basis, passive investment, that's pretty hard. And generally it takes, 2, 3, 4 years to get to a point where, you can take money out of the business, like, on that kind of scale, outside of, maybe an area development deal or some larger investment where you're putting, a lot more capital.
Yeah. And then there are some needles in the haystack that just, they do extremely well, and they're just, it's like, gosh, if I would have known that, I would have, bought,
Right.
a bunch of those a few years ago.
Right.
And, but that's a problem with averages. Like you were saying, I mean, that's the average that you've surveyed. And, there's a lot of, what about this? What about that in it? But I think the important thing to take away is, as people review the disclosure document, there's numbers in there, and you come up with your own plan. No consultant should ever be telling you any financial numbers ever.
Right. Right.
And if they do, run away from them, because it's like illegal. They shouldn't be doing that. And there's reasons for that, but you need to look at the document, everything the franchisor provides you, come up with what you're thinking, and then you validate that against what is actually happening with franchisees out there in the field, in the business, actually doing what you want to do. So any last bits of wisdom on, someone that is like ready to make a decision, but they just have some more, like they want to make sure that their numbers are accurate before they're ready to actually pull the trigger?
Yeah. I mean, I think, you make a great point. I mean, if you do your homework and you have kind of your numbers put together in a plan, and I always tell people, if you're signing a 5-year franchise agreement, you need a 5-year plan. If you're signing a 10-year franchise agreement, you need to, a 10-year plan. And when I say that, like, obviously life's going to happen and you're not going to hit plan exactly. But if you go through that process and kind of work through those numbers and understand how the business model works and are realistic about, what profits really are, talk to an accountant. First of all, have a good accountant kind of walk through that process with you. But then go out and talk to franchisees. And again, when you've done your homework like that, and you can talk to franchisees in the system that you're thinking about investing in, they were in your shoes a few years ago. They'll be happy to, say, oh, your cost of goods is off by a couple percentage points, or
Mm-hmm.
this looks a little low, or this looks a little high, whatever. Again, don't call somebody up and say, how much money did you make last year? But, just check in with them, and do it with various people. So you're not spending, 10 hours with one person. Obviously they're busy trying to run their own business. Be very courteous of their time. But, I think for the most part, franchisees want to help candidates, serious candidates,
Mm-hmm.
get the information they need and make that decision, because they know what that was like for them when they were trying to figure out the same thing.
That's some great advice. Don't just ask how much money you're making, because if you get that, you may not get what their perception of money that they're making and what you're thinking could be completely off. It's better to understand the financial model and the things that change and move in that model than it is just like a final number that may or may not be accurate.
Right.
So again, if you want to talk to me about buying a franchise, go to talkwitheric.com and check out Franchise Business Review. What are the best places to find Franchise Business Review, Eric?
Well, certainly franchisebusinessreview.com. Not quite as short as Talk to Eric. Have you registered the Eric spelled with a C version? Maybe I should get that domain.
No way. Yeah, someone actually it's Talk with Eric, and I did both of them. I think I did both of them. I have another one that's like Talk to Eric, and I've got both of them on one of them and only one of them on the other. So that's why I try to say K.
Gotcha.
But K is the right way to spell it. So
Right.
But franchisebusinessreview.com. Eric, thanks for taking the time to be on the show and giving us some wisdom that you've learned over the years, being deep into franchising. Unlike you have a vantage point that very few people have. So thanks for sharing your wisdom with us today.
Absolutely. Appreciate the time.